Welcome to this special edition podcast of the Duluth News Tribune Minute Podcast. I am Neal Ronquist, Group Publisher of Forum Communication Company's Duluth Media Group, which includes the Duluth News Tribune, the Superior Telegram, the Cloquet Pine Journal, and the Woman Today magazine. Today we're introducing and discussing Forum Communication Company's inaugural Trust Week, which will take place April 1st through the 7th, 2023. Trust Week is our effort to help audience members and our communities better understand the business of gathering and reporting news. With me to discuss the business of gathering news and why trust is vital is Dr. Jennifer Moore, Journalism Program Director at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Dr. Moore, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Neal.
So, yeah, it's great. We've talked a little about the purpose of this, and let's get right into it. And I think I'll just start with a question to you, and this is going to be kind of informal, a back and forth. You asking me questions, me asking you.
Great.
But let's start with this basic question of, what is the role of a news organization today in the big picture of the industry and of our country, I guess?
That is a big question. So if we think about your role as the Duluth News Tribune here locally, regionally, you're the more intellectual answer to that would be you're a convener of community conversation. And what I mean by that is that, you're providing a service to citizens to make decisions on how to live in our community. You're providing them with vital information they know to need how to vote, even arts and entertainment information. Sports is obviously something that's very important, to this community too. But and generally speaking, that's your role. And I'm so glad to hear that you're leaning into this Trust Week that you have, because I think it's important to be really transparent with your audience today, the people who are relying on your news, to better understand, what it means to be a news organization and serving your community.
Certainly, we all recognize that technology is impacting all facets of our life, including news gathering, media in general. How do you see the role of a news gathering organization having changed over the course of the last decade, or even maybe even a shorter time? Has there been fundamental change?
Well, the fact that you're a newspaper and we're doing a podcast, I think would be one big difference. You're a newspaper. You do multimedia now. You're doing, this audio interview that will come out in the form of a podcast, video. My research background is 19th century journalism. So I look at newspapers before photography was able to be put into newspapers. So, that's been around for a long time, but we sort of take for granted that, it's very commonplace, obviously, to have photographs in newspapers and illustrations and data visualizations, but that's something that you see more. And obviously, not to neglect online, right? Your newspaper now is a digital first newspaper where you have print editions that come out twice a week, and that's a significant change that I'm sure you hear a lot about from your readers too.
You mentioned your research, and I'm curious, in that research, in other eras, maybe some of our audience remembers the yellow journalism period and things of that nature. Are there similarities in, centuries past that can be brought forward today as to kind of what we're seeing with trustworthiness and this fake news label?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Since in the colonial era through now, we can find examples where news organizations have used techniques to attract readers that tend to be either sensational, where there's some truth in there, but at the same time they're exaggerating the truth, to put it one way. But then there's straight up fake news that you could say that there have been journalists who have fabricated news in order to promote sales. There are a lot of examples, and you asked about. And I don't want to go into too many details because we could talk about this for a long time. But one thing that I do in the classroom with my students is I try to use history to put a lens on the current state of the news media. I think we've come a long way. We obviously have ethical standards. We have a Society for Professional Journalists who outline, what ethical standards should be, what we want journalists to adhere to. Early 20th century, there was the development of schools of journalism and journalism programs that I teach in that help aspiring journalists understand some of the professional norms that come with the role of reporting on your community. One thing that I suppose I should have mentioned in the first question, but of course your role is vital, essential to maintaining our democracy and really being an example of protecting free speech and First Amendment rights too. So that's something that hasn't always been the case with the press, that I think that we've really put a lens on that in recent years, considering politicians, for example, who have called the press the enemy of the people, for example, right? And you're really combating an environment where you have a lot of people coming after you that might not necessarily understand what your role is. So I think this Trust Week initiative is really great to help your constituents understand what your role is in the community.
So we recognize that we don't always hit the mark. And I think we'd like to think that we're our own worst critic, that we really are hard on ourselves when we miss the mark. And as we prepared for this, I asked you to think about and evaluate the job that we were doing. And I guess my question would be, what's your assessment of how a community newspaper like the Duluth News Tribune is doing compared to maybe other national outlets or, other providers of content that maybe some of the people here consume on a regular basis?
I have thought a lot about that question that you asked me to think about our conversation today. And I suppose what I want to emphasize is, your role is very different from regional or national news outlets, right? You're serving your local community. I don't have to tell you about the depletion of resources that you've had over the past several years, decades probably. I think, honestly, you're probably doing the best with what you have. I do agree with you that I think that most of the time you are your own best critic, so to speak. I think what a lot of us would love to see is just more investment in your newsroom. We'd like to see this newsroom come back to maybe higher numbers and reporters being able to report on communities. Everybody that I talk to would love to see the daily print product come back. We know that's probably not a reality, but we can always hope. But yeah, I think I would hesitate from comparing what you do here locally to national or regional news organizations. So that's really a non-answer for you, I guess.
So in this environment that we're in, how does a news organization or how can a news organization go about earning trust or raising its trust level?
Well, I think it's things that you're doing that you could probably do more of. Being in the community, you have journalists who live in the community, you're participating in community conversations with citizens. I think one thing that we talk about a lot in Duluth, and since the murder of George Floyd, the reckoning with thinking about diversity and inclusion issues. Does your newsroom look like the community that you serve? Are you talking to folks in the community who feel like they're being served by your newspaper? A lot of it is getting into the community and having those conversations with folks that you serve. That's probably something you could do more of, but I'm also very aware of the limited resources you have in your newsroom to do that as well. Yeah, I guess those are some thoughts off the top of my head. Might think of some more too as our conversation continues.
And, along those lines, you mentioned the ethical standards that most news organizations or newspapers adhere to, the professional training, maybe we haven't touched on that, but the professional training that our reporters and journalists go through as it relates to their college degrees or ongoing training of sort. I guess for our audience members, the fact that those standards are being adhered to, what degree should people, I guess, put on that as far as it relates to trust? I guess what I'm trying to say is that what degree is that show that we're making that commitment to be transparent and trustworthy?
Wow. So I guess the first thing I would say is that I would see my role as a professor in higher education. I teach journalism classes. I do teach some what you would call skills classes, but I also teach a lot of our conceptual or theoretical classes. What we're doing at a university is trying to teach students how to be critical thinkers and be good citizens. I still do believe in that. But of course, students are coming to college and they want a job when they graduate. So we're mindful of that too. And that's what I love about teaching in a journalism program, is that we can bridge professional, practical skills with these conceptual, theoretical things that we're trying to do in the classroom to make our students, just better people, for lack of a better way of putting it. I see students who come into a newsroom, it's an apprenticeship experience in a lot of ways. They're learning the culture of a particular newsroom. They're learning from folks who have been doing this for a long time about the norms and standards. There's only so much we can do in a classroom environment. And our journalism program, we make a lot of efforts to give our students these professional newsroom experiences when we can, in and out of the classroom. We just had an event last night that you may be aware of where several of your newsroom reporters attended an event that we did, and it was great. And students get to meet with your staff and learn about the business and the profession of journalism. And I don't know if I answered the second part of your question, so if I didn't, please remind me what I need to say.
I think you did well with that.
Yeah.
And so I think we've now touched on sort of what the landscape looks like from a competitive situation. We've touched on what the training goes into it. One of the things that's a force right now is social media, and it has been, right? And so we talk a lot about how our competition as a news gathering organization has really changed over the course of time now, because it's not just necessarily other traditional media outlets. It could be the citizen journalist with a blog. It could be somebody just posting on Facebook and Twitter. And we hear a lot about how that's the conduit for them getting their news and information. Can you comment on that, the difference between, again, the standards or a professional organization like ourselves versus somebody who may only get their information through a social media channel?
This is a really big and important question. The social media organizations that you're competing with don't have the resources, don't have the expertise, don't have the training that your newsroom has. You have people who are going to city council meetings that are building relationships with the stakeholders in the community to report. They don't have the same standards that you do to, fact check, get more than one source to confirm something. Somebody can put something on TikTok. I mean, you mentioned fake news earlier, right? And there's a lot of folks that study, how news spreads and how this, misinformation and disinformation spreads. But I would like to think that it's really a lot about educating the public to know where to go to find reliable news. You are one among many sources in the Duluth community. We have television stations. We have a couple of online sources that I would say are reliable as well. But yes, it's a problem that's bigger than your organization can handle. And I don't want to go down a road of talking about alternatives right now. Maybe we could get into that at some point. But I think, again, just turning back to this whole idea that you're trying to be more transparent about what the role is of a newspaper in a community, what you can do to communicate that to the public. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about newspaper content, what's editorial content, what's opinion content, what's hard news, etc. I think there's a lot of confusion in the public. And to me, it really comes down to news literacy and media literacy education starting from cradle to grave, to be honest with you. So that's a much bigger conversation. But I think about, what role could the Duluth News Tribune, for example, play in our community to help young people understand, what a news organization means to, maintain democracy and the First Amendment.
I'm glad you posed that question, and I'll take it. I've thought personally, and I think our company's thinking personally a lot about the educational factor of what it is we provide. And it's education on so many topics, right? It's how does our government run? How do our communities run? What do people need to know to be, good citizens that are contributing in a meaningful way to the place that we all live and work in. And I think that you're correct that we've got to do a better job of showing that our intent is just to help inform and educate, and not necessarily to, at worst, indoctrinate or however you want to characterize that. We're not trying to necessarily, convince people of an opinion that we may have. It's more, okay, we're collecting content or information from a number of different sources to help people make their own determination and really understand, what it is that may be the driving force of whatever the topic is. So it's something that's, really in the forefront of, what we're, doing going forward. You mentioned too about opinion, and we get this question a lot about where does news start and where does opinion start. And one of the things that we do here at the News Tribune is that our opinion page is really firewalled, if you will, off from our news gathering operation. We have a editorial board, which myself, Chuck Frederick, our opinion page editor, sits on. We have an employee representative and typically 2 to 3 citizen representatives on that are helping us really to guide community conversation. It's meant to, give as much opportunity for those on whatever side of an issue to have the ability to espouse their opinion and allow for the community to have a conversation about it. And really proud of the work we're doing there. Chuck is an award-winning opinion page editor, just got recognized again with 2 large awards. And I think, again, the awards show that we're doing some things right. That's not the end-all, be-all of why we do this. But again, I think it's important. I think it shows the health of a news gathering operation and a community newspaper that we're willing to still engage, and start those community conversations.
And that very explanation that you gave about the difference between, the news and firewalled between opinion and editorial, that could be better articulated to the public, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that could be something that could appear on the website, just how you explain that, right? And even bringing in some of those, the folks that you have in the community that are a part of your editorial board, right? To explain what they feel like their role is, right? If that could be something that could even be these community conversations to include even more people. I mean, at the end of the day, you all are the watchdogs to protect the public, right? I mean, that's, the term that we like to use, the watchdog or the bulldog. Get a little UMD plug in there, right? Yeah. And the education part that we were talking about, thinking about, I guess I'll just give an example from my childhood. I did not grow up in Minnesota. I'm from the state south of here, Iowa, and the community that I grew up in, our daily newspaper had a kids section for a few years when I was in grade school, and this is back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was written for grade school age children. There was, news that was written in a way that I was able to understand it at that age. And then there was puzzles and things like that were geared towards, a grade school audience. And it was a great way to think about how I was going to say indoctrinate, but of course that's not what I mean. It's a great example of how you can show young people what a newspaper can be in a community and how it can be a source of information, a source of entertainment, etc. If I think there's the famous, Thomas Jefferson quote that I'd rather, if I had to choose between a nation or a democracy and a newspaper, I'd choose a newspaper. But again, I cannot emphasize more really being able to communicate your role, that why you're so fundamental. One of the conversations I know you and I had, Neal, is, you're never going to win over everyone. There's always going to be those critics that don't understand or don't want to understand what role you play in the community. But if you can really lean into, you're the protectors of free speech ultimately, right? And I think that's something that's very important to a lot of citizens, and probably especially some of your critics that feel like their free speech is threatened. But if there's a way that you can communicate to the public that, hey, we're here and we're actually, whether you like us or not, we're here and we're a part of protecting free speech.
I'm glad you circled back to students and student-aged audience members or content consumers. We are in the process, a company, of revamping what's been our newspapers and education program. And this typically was delivering hard or newsprint copies of the newspaper into classrooms. And of course, our younger generation, they are not a print-centric generation. They're on their phones, they're on their tablets, they're consuming their content in audio form, in video form, in text form. So we've got to go where the audience is. And we are in the process of revamping that program and essentially allowing digital access to students across the Northland to be able to experience what you and I experienced back in our school days, which was with the newspaper. But now it's going to be, again, in that format and in that medium that they are used to and want to see it in. So we're excited about that because we recognize that the next generation doesn't have to be print consumers, but we want them to be content consumers. Right. I mean, that's such a great point, Neal, because I think that I agree. I mean, one of the classes that I teach is digital storytelling. So we're teaching students how to tell stories in a variety of media. I still think fundamentally, literacy has got to be part of it. We have to have students reading something, and I actually won't get into this, but I think actually having a physical newspaper, it's such a very different experience to consume news than it is to see digital news. But at the same time, where's your audience? They're online. And is it necessarily a good thing that they're getting news in small sips as opposed to being able to read a longer, more in-depth story? No, but I suppose you have to start somewhere. And if there is something that could help with just educating, people at a young age, why it's important to be a consumer of news and the benefits that they can get from that as well. But you're fighting, a multi
trillion-dollar business that is really impacting the way that you've delivered news for centuries, right? So how do you negotiate that? It's daunting to think about, but I think, it's basically the idea like you have to innovate or die, really. So
that, that's very true. And you mentioned earlier that, the community, and I understand, would like to see the 7-day-a-week printed newspaper come back. But, that unfortunately, that's a business decision, and we've got to be so many more in different things to different audiences that it requires, calculated decisions, where, what's the best decision for the business going forward in order for it to be a going concern. And so we've had to make those pivots. And for some of us that have been in this business for a long time, that's hard. I mean, it's hard to, leave behind the habit that people have had. It's hard to, think about how you redirect resources. I've told my team members here often that, it would be a lot easier to start over than to try to go through this transition, because it's a muddy transition. But I don't know at the end that you'd want it any other way, because you're taking all the good things that have been established over hundreds of years and bringing those along with you and just adapting them to a new world. And so I think that having those basic standards and tenets does us well going forward. One of the things that you had mentioned about messaging that we could do better kind of resonated with me, and that I think we definitely have to communicate what's the difference of news and opinion that better. But I think one of the things that strikes me is that we share a commonality, and the news, whether it was in print or now it's wherever, it's a gathering place essentially. It's a common view of what's going on around us, and if we don't have those fabrics of things that we share, where do we go as a community and as a country if we can't have a shared place, and so that resonates with me as well, and we think about that a lot.
And that's what I've really appreciated about living in Duluth. And for full disclosure, I've only been here since 2015. I lived in the Twin Cities for many years and was familiar with Duluth, but when I had an opportunity to apply for the job that I now have, I was just delighted to be able to move here, and I really feel like my spouse and I are thriving in this community, and it's a perfect size for a community to really sort of build those community connections that you're talking about, Neal. I see the DNT as being one of those stakeholders that can really drive that conversation and make people feel like they're a part of a community. We can't underestimate what COVID has done, the civil unrest has done. And in the spirit of being transparent, we should probably describe, the newsroom that we're in now, which is pretty empty, right? Because you have a lot of your folks who are working remotely now, it seems to, and that's a conversation that we're having in a lot of different industries, right? What's happened with the culture of the newsroom, where I think about my students who will soon be working in newsrooms like this, just what you learn from those informal conversations that you have in a newsroom, for example, about the practice, the professionalism, how to get sources to talk with you, how to build that trust in community, how to know where you have to draw a line between being too close with a source versus being able to be someone who can, speak truthfully and accurately about what you're reporting on. I don't know. That's something that if I get to ask you any questions. So, I mean, you've been in this business for a long time, Neal. What do you, it may be too soon to estimate that too, but I mean, what changes have you seen as a consequence of having a lot of your reporters working remotely now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we're really taking a hard look at right now, because we are coming out of the pandemic, and so we've had a chance to sit back and see how things worked, and we learned a lot of things during from 2020 to now. Some of those things have served us well. We've leaned into technology, whether that's things like Zoom meetings or things of that nature. But you very succinctly touched on what we feel is something that is important and is missing, and that is that organic communication that happens. And it's not, you touched on reporter to reporter or reporter to editor. It goes deeper than that. It goes to, our sales reps coming in and out of the building and being able to communicate with their colleagues on the news side and saying, hey, I saw this while I was out, or I heard this. It even go, up to my level where, I can go now weeks or months without seeing somebody in person. And that's a challenge on the HR side of things, where how is somebody doing? Not only from a skill set, but just personally, how are they doing? And we've noticed that things can kind of wind out of control maybe a little bit faster because we can't identify as easily through a Zoom meeting how somebody truly is feeling, and we've all been through a lot, right? And our reporters have had to cover, a lot of tough issues, a lot of heavy issues, and that weighs on a reporter after a while. And so all those things are factors that we're taking a hard look at. We want to continue to balance that, right, with the flexibility that we're offering our workforce, because that's one of a work-life balance is important, to us as a company. So we don't want to be rigid, but we do recognize that there are challenges that and questions that I think need evaluation. One of the other things along those lines too is that energy. When there is a story going on or happening in the newsroom, there is a chaotic energy or kinetic energy. Either one, chaotic is good too. But it feeds though, and it gets people talking, and stories become more developed and things of that nature. And so we're aware of that, and it is a challenge. And we've had a couple people on staff that have actually started during the pandemic. Getting them to consider coming into more of an office setting on a more routine basis, that's kind of a challenge for them because they don't know what that feels or looks like either. So a lot of variables there that are certainly important.
Yeah, and it's so, and this is obviously, it affects every industry and mine, and I have to say that I have appreciated some of the affordances that technology like Zoom, where I can attend a meeting and I don't have to, it's great. And I'm not saying that, you need to, why isn't this newsroom buzzing with people again? But it is that balance, right? And I so appreciate that you are talking about being mindful of the mental health of your reporting staff, because I think that's one thing that organizations like yours really need to recognize, that, your reporters are on the front lines, like police or fire, and need to be treated as first responders. And there's the myth of, being objective but of course that's a complete myth. It's seeking the truth and reporting it is your mission, right? And I think that the more that your reporters are given that space to recognize that they need a mental health break, or they can work remotely for a day and still do their job, is so important. So I'm really glad to hear you're recognizing that, because I think we're all still trying to negotiate what is this. It doesn't feel, and it isn't characterized as a post-pandemic world yet, but obviously we're out of the worst of it, at least for now. And how are we all negotiating, this new transition into wanting to be back in person, but knowing there are affordances that allow us to do things remotely too?
Very well said. I want to go back in the early part of our conversation. You had mentioned stakeholders and community stakeholders, and those stakeholders, it's really everyone in our community or our coverage area is a stakeholder, regardless of they're an audience member of ours or not. But one of the questions that I posed to you in preparation for this was to think about how deep do people want us to go into explaining what it is we do. I mean, what's important for an audience member to know about our business? Is it what we've talked about already, which is what are our standards, what are our practices when it comes to news gathering? Do we need to be more transparent when it comes to how do we formulate opinions? We've talked a little bit about that. Is it even beyond that though? Do they have an interest in how our business runs and operates? What are our values? What is our, how do we use any influence we have? Things of that nature. So what do you see there? How much do stakeholders want to know about?
Yeah, and stakeholders could be everyone. It's basically the citizenry, right? And I think you would get different answers depending on who you spoke with. But I think the more transparent you can be, the better. And the one thing that people I work with around the world who study journalism, it's like journalism just isn't a business. It's more than that. I mean, you're protected by the First Amendment. You have an obligation to your citizens. That makes you more than just a business to me. And I think that's been part of the challenge that a lot of newspapers like yours have had is that, I will say, the newspapers that are beholden to stakeholders, which you are not, I know, because you're a family-owned newspaper. But, is a newspaper, television stations, any news organization is more than just a business because you do have this essential role in a democracy. And that's a conversation that I think would be really helpful to have with citizens and even folks who think that they are pretty savvy news consumers too. But again, getting back to this idea of making it normalizing having these conversations in the community too, and really including and being collaborative with these stakeholders and including them in these conversations. Again, I think newspapers are probably the best example who are criticized all the time, and you're getting critiques from the public, and you take those critiques seriously and you try to make course corrections when you can. And at the same time, knowing that, you're going to do some things that are going to be very unpopular, but they're necessary to do as well. But again, I think just getting back to thinking about being community members as well, collaborating with these various stakeholders, having these conversations, doing things like you're doing, and not just making it 1 week a year, right? Maybe even making it some type of fundamental change in the way you run your operation. If you want things to change, you have to start doing things differently. And this is maybe one path into doing things differently too. And that's a much bigger conversation than we're obviously going to have today. And I think that's one thing that, where I work, an institution of higher education, we have a land grant mission to serve the public as well. So very similar. And so I think about all the time about opportunities to try to collaborate with you all here as well as other media entities too. So that's another conversation we're not going to have on this podcast, obviously, but something to think about too.
Yeah, really good point.
Yeah.
I want to cover just one more area a little bit further in depth, and then I'll let you ask any questions you may have of me. I want to talk a little bit more on transparency and why that's important. And, we mentioned the word trust and truth and, the counter to fake news and that. But what is at the heart of it? What does transparency mean, and what does that look like? We've touched on it to some degree, but I think it'd be worthwhile to really explain to audience members what transparency means for a news gathering organization.
Boy, so what is so you're asking, just to make sure I understand the question, you're asking what the audience would expect to understand about a newsroom being transparent?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I think it's understanding what the job of a journalist is. It's understanding that this is, as I just said, that it's more than a business, but it is, this is a business that does rely on advertising dollars primarily to support the work that you do, what it means when you have the challenges from technology that cut into those resources, and why you've had to make changes. I can't tell you some of the smartest people I know that I work with at the university that are in other disciplines when I talk about how between Facebook Marketplace and, many years ago, Craigslist and others have completely, it's been a catastrophic effect on your revenue. And they're like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that before. And to me, of course, it's obvious, and I don't have to tell you all how that's impacted your bottom line for decades. But it's thinking about just the, from an institutional standpoint, what is the role of a newspaper in a democracy? How are you protecting free speech and First Amendment rights? It's at an organizational level, you have an ad sales side, you have an editorial side. Those are very separate. How you negotiate when you have to do those hard stories on somebody who might be an advertiser, or do those difficult stories on city government. You critically need to be fiercely independent, right? And not have relationships that cross those lines where you're not going to report on something that's essential for a community to know. And then there's the side of, how are you serving your audience? And we've talked a lot about, and should continue to talk about, how technology has completely disrupted your relationship with your audiences, right? And you have to go where your consumers are. But at the same time, I don't want anybody to only get their news from TikTok or from Instagram, right? But then there are ways that I think newsrooms like yours are being innovative. And I think that you could lean into that innovation a little bit more with thinking about how you can reach audiences on social media in ways that are really meaningful. This is one example, right? Doing podcasts now. When I don't recall when y'all started doing podcasts here, but 20 years ago, I'm guessing no, right? Yeah.
It's probably been within the last 10.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things in terms of, and everything that I just mentioned, that's a way to be more transparent with the public, with, like I said, as an institution, as an organization, your relationship with consumers, the product that you're actually putting out there, how are news stories, how do reporters go out and gather information, how do they distill it down into a news article or into a podcast or into maybe a news package, right? All the different ways, doing big data stories and how you're distilling down that big data into digestible information that people can use in their daily lives.
So I'm going to lean into your answer because I think there's a number of questions that you posed to me in that answer that I could touch on. So one of the first things is the independence, and I think that one of the things that you mentioned, our family ownership of our company. One of the things that we did through the pandemic is we did not take any PPP money or any federal, state, or local loans or grants, and part of that goes directly to what you said. We are fiercely independent and did not want to be, connected at all to, a government. Handout is probably too strong, but we just did not want to be attached to having, the government fund our business in any way like that. So we remain, really fiercely independent, and we want to be, respectful in our relationships with local government. We want to be part of solutions and conversations when we can be. But yes, we're going to cover the hard stories when they happen. That's part of our role. One of the other things that I hear often when I'm out giving speeches to clubs and organizations is that I don't think that people understand our economic model. And I appreciate you bringing that up.
I would agree.
Because people see us as often as a community utility, which is fantastic because they take ownership in us and they are so passionate about us that they feel that ownership, which that is great. We want that. But I think it often blurs that we are a for-profit business, that, we have obligations. We have obligations to our employees. We have obligations to our vendors. We have obligations to our ownership. We have obligations to the community to make sure that we're, a healthy, profitable concern where we can employ people at good wages and provide good benefits and things of that nature. And so, I think that gets lost sometimes, that, news gathering is in most cases, a for-profit business. There are nonprofit models, and that's a topic for a different day, but we are a for-profit model. That model has been significantly disrupted, not just in this pandemic era, but even prior to that. It's now 2 decades or more of disruption. And you mentioned Craigslist, and he's one of my favorite people when I give speeches to point out about what he did to not only the newspaper industry, but media in general, but largely to the newspaper industry, that he took out billions of dollars out of the revenue stream and has never paid, as far as I'm aware of, any taxes to the city of Duluth or, St. Louis County or the state of Minnesota. It used to be where we were probably 70% supported by advertising and 30% what we would call consumer revenue. And now it's nearly 50-50, or actually 60-40 consumer driven. And that's where the model is going. The model is going to a much more consumer supported model than an advertising model.
So subscription based is
subscription
what you're
based,
saying.
correct.
Right,
yes.
right.
Memberships either in print, and we call those combo memberships where it's a print and digital access, or digital only. Yeah, so that's been a significant change from when I first was a publisher in 1998. We were mainly driven by advertising, preprint revenue, which came from your big box stores. Classified revenue was a major category, and then you had your subscriber revenue. But really, advertising had served as a mechanism to keep subscriber rates low.
And circling back, thinking about through a historical lens too, and I'm not going to give this a lot of time, but newspapers in this country really started as tied to political parties and helped grow political parties where they served an elite audience. They were not intended to serve the masses. And they were subscription based and they were supported that way. And then you come into the era of the penny press that now is the model that we're still struggling with, where it's supposed to, you're serving a mass audience. Most news organizations are for-profit business that relied on advertising for centuries. But now we're coming back to this, whatever this is that we're in now. We know what it is now, but this model where, like you said, this 50-50 balance. But thinking about how you're talking about this still being a for-profit business, I think the fundamental question is that the best model to serve people, right? Is a for-profit newspaper still the best way to serve a community when you're the essential holders of, the democratic process and protecting those First Amendment freedoms? I mean, that's a very intellectual question that I'm sure we can't get into today, but that's something to think about too. What are the alternatives? And you mentioned that considering how you want to stay fiercely independent, that you did not take that PPP money from the government. There are other models in other parts of the world that do have more of a government tie to their news organizations, which comes with benefits and real challenges too. And this is sort of the reckoning that I think that we need to have in this country. I don't have the answers to this. I mean, there are conversations that I'm delighted that can happen and will continue to happen too. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. And
it is, we're seeing that play out across the United States for certain, and even here in Minnesota, where it's really dependent on who the stewards of the newspaper brand is in a particular community. And we're fortunate that we're a family-owned company by the Marcel family who feel an obligation to the communities that we own brands in, that they're stewards of this, as I described, this community utility. And you've seen that where the communities where we have newspapers, again, not without challenge, but we're still investing in our newsrooms. We're still investing in the content part of it. We're reinventing ourselves on the advertising side because it has become a much more digitally based product where we've had to, dig in and lean into how do we get better in that arena, the paid model on the digital side as well. So it's not without challenges, but there, you have the example of the Star Tribune, which again has a billionaire benefactor in essence, and that you've seen that in other places in the country where, again, the steward of that, if they have those types of pockets and that type of community-oriented vision, those media entities are doing okay or well. And then, we've seen situations like has occurred in St. Cloud where you have corporate-owned and devastating where, and now, and frankly, just again, to be transparent, we've seen an opportunity there where we've started a product, St. Cloud Live, to go into that market to provide that community with a better news source. And we're doing the same in Sioux Falls. And those are both Gannett-owned papers where, unfortunately, that corporate entity maybe doesn't have the connection to the regent and the community as strongly as we do. Yeah,
these corporate-owned, newspapers, can they continue to serve communities as they need to and should? Oh boy, yeah. This is such a great conversation to have, and I hope it's one of many that we can continue to have, because I think that we're only going to solve these problems together. There's no expectation that you at the Duluth News Tribune can single-handedly solve these problems, and working, with the family who owns this newspaper and others. And it makes me think about something that you said a little bit earlier about, how you want to be part of the solutions. And something that has become on my radar that I'm trying to do more in my classrooms is thinking about, you have the who, what, where, when, and why, how, but also the what's working part of doing your job, and thinking about, in communities where you report on tragedy or these wicked problems like climate change or the economy, and what can reporters do to actually present readers with some solutions to some of these problems? Because I think this is where a lot of your readers probably, and your consumers, get a lot of news fatigue, where they're reading about, these things that they need to know that are not great things happening in the community, but what are the solutions to get out of the problems? And I know there might be opportunities here at the Duluth News Tribune to think about how you could maybe lean into that type of reporting sometimes that could actually, and I think that there's evidence to suggest that gets maybe your readers more engaged if there's some hope in those stories sometimes, because a lot of times reporters are on deadlines, they've got to get the information out, and there isn't that time to really develop those stories and go more in depth and find those solutions and talk to those community stakeholders that can bring that type of substance to a story. And I'm not talking about, oh, these are happy stories about things that are happening, because of course you want to talk about the challenges to those possible solutions too. But that's just something that you said that made me think about ways that you can maybe, in light of transparency, but also fundamentally change some of the reporting that you're able to do in this community too, if you can lean in and do more of that in-depth story. I think those Northlandia pieces that you're doing, they're not really solutions-oriented, but they are those more in-depth stories that go into the historical context of things that in our community that we just, in a lot of ways, take for granted, right?
Yeah. Yes, and you had asked me earlier about changes that I had noted in the disruption of our business over time. And one of the exciting changes that is occurring is the ability to see data, collect data in real time, and then analyze and understand the data. And this is really, it's reader or audience member behavioral data that we're talking about here. It's like, what do readers engage with? And when we were a print-only product, it was through conversation, and it was through maybe just that simple yes, no, I'm going to buy a subscription or I'm not. That was all the feedback we really had, other than, maybe, again, letters to the editor or a call in to the editor or publisher about something making the mark or not hitting the mark. But now we have real-time data where we can see, how is the audience interacting with a particular story. And so we know that what we can tell, and this is still it's early on yet in this evolving arena, is that the more unique story we can craft, and unique meaning either no other source has it, or it's something of significant construction where it's an enterprise story, solutions oriented, how to oriented. It goes beyond what we term transactional news. And an example of transactional news would be a car crash, or even what happened at the mall the other day with the roof collapse.
Gosh, right?
It's a horrific story, and we need to be there and cover it. But that's also going to be covered by dozens of other media outlets. So it's how do you make that unique? What can we do to make that, either a story like that offer a unique perspective, or where do we find other stories that have those unique perspectives? And so we're really leaning into analytics and what the audience members are telling us. And it's actually more than a daily. It's almost a minute by minute look at what is our audience responding to, and what are they not? And so from a reader standpoint, I think the one thing that I would share is that there's going to continue to be change when it comes to what it is we cover. And some things we're going to have to either leave entirely behind, or maybe not cover as in depth anymore, because most of the audience, that topic may not resonate with them.
At the same time, I would want you, as a news organization who have the expertise and the community ties, it's like, you have to take your medicine in some ways, right? So, I think that it's terrific. I'm also curious about, these metrics, and I have a question about that data, but there's also something to balance with, I want you, the Duluth News Tribune, to tell me the things that I need to know that I don't know that I need to know, and not lean in as much, sports sections are a direct result of giving people what they want to know, and these stem back to the 19th century, right? And I think there's something that really sustained your newspaper, that sports coverage, which I would not want to see that go away. But at the same time, that should supplement some of these, harder news stories, both in terms of, how you talk about quote unquote hard news, but also difficult stories that people need to know, right? And being able to put the resources into those stories too. And getting back to the data that you were talking about, your news organization, like all news organizations, have to rely on Facebook and Twitter and these other corporations that you have no control over for people who read your stories, to access your stories. They're not all going to the Duluth News Tribune website to find your stories. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of where your audiences are. The traffic that's coming to your website, but how they're getting there. Do you have any sense of where people are coming from to read your stories?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. Yeah. So let me start with, first of all, the economic part of that. We do not get any money or funding from Google or Facebook. Google and Facebook get to use, well,
they make money off of
Google
you.
especially, yes, they make money off of us. They are an aggregator that essentially, takes content not only from us, but from, all the sources, a lot of sources throughout the world, and then disseminates it and have people coming to their site. They can then sell advertising on their site for a higher rate because they've got more eyeballs coming to their site than we do to our site. And that's the economic impact of this, is that, what we have to weigh is what would happen if our content wasn't there versus the damage of what's being done. And so that's where this discussion about should Google or Facebook contribute in some manner back to news gathering organizations, some sort of dollars paying for that content. And
it's really fundamentally like this 21st century Gilded Age question, right? We were in the 19th century, there were factory workers that were paid poorly. They didn't have 40-hour work weeks that were making people like Carnegie billionaires, right? And I see those parallels too. I mean, that's not necessarily the newspaper industry, but your industry as well as many others are impacted by these big technology companies that are making so much money off the backs of the work that you all are doing and others.
Yeah. So to the question about can we see where people are coming from? Yes, we can see, are they being referred to us through social channels? So we can see that. We can see, are they coming from Facebook? Are they coming from Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and with some of our products now? So yes, we can see that. And again, the question becomes, if it's kind of like the lost leader in a grocery store, right? Grocers will put products on sale to attract people to come in so that they buy other products. And we're using it kind of as the same thing. It's a mechanism to get potential audience members to come and see us. And if they're interested in that one piece of content and they see something else, maybe that will be enough to convince them to become a member. So that's why we're there, and that's why we use it. We also have the ability to track what device people are coming in: desktop, mobile, tablet. And it's really, it's probably not a surprise, but during the Monday through Friday during work hours, most of the traffic is coming in through desktop. And that switches in the late afternoon to where virtually everything comes through mobile. And we've talked a little bit about sports, and you'll see that with sports especially, that is a very strong mobile consumer. So those are all things that we have to look at, and that goes into a deeper question about how do you serve the content there?
Right.
How do you contextualize it? Those are all very again, in the simplest form, we used to write one story and it went out on printed newspaper. Well, now we've got to consider not only that story and the construction, but how is it being delivered, and what is the reader experience on the back end of that? Is it visual enough? Are we using audio in an appropriate manner? All of those things are factors. So we may go through multiple rewrites or multiple construction on a particular story because we're serving it on multiple different platforms.
Well, and what a completely different role as a newspaper. I mean, we still call you a newspaper, right? But you're really a multimedia organization, and you're the news organization of a record in this community too. I mean, people look to you. Obviously, there are other news organizations in this community, but people look to the Duluth News Tribune to be that authority, that standalone authority in this community too. Yeah, it's a lot.
It is
a lot.
Well, we have gone through a range of topics here. Dr. Moore, I appreciate you so much coming in and talking to me today and to our audience members today. It's been delightful. We're going to keep this conversation going.
I would be so happy to do that, and I feel like there's so many more things to say, and I look forward to it.
Great. And again, we welcome community input as well, and we're here to be good stewards and to continue to usher this multimedia organization into this next generation of what news gathering looks like. So thanks again, audience members. Please check out our additional content that's going to be circulated and published across all of our different platforms during Trust Week, April 1st through the 7th. We'd appreciate your feedback on how you feel about Trust Week, how you interact with the content, what we could perhaps touch on or look more in depth in future Trust Weeks going forward. So, Dr. Moore, thank you again, and to our audience, have a great day.